Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Alec, and I'm going to be here today to help answer any of your general or technical questions that you have. But before we get started, I'd like to cover a couple things you need to know about the session today. There is no dial-in number for today's webinar. All audio will be streamed through your computer speakers or headphones, so please adjust your volume there accordingly. You can submit questions for today's speakers or any technical issues you may run into by clicking on the Q&A icon on the right-hand side of your screen. Type in your question there and click submit. If it's content related, we will have some time for questions at the end, so it may be pulled if time allows. And if it is a technical question, I'll have an answer for you that will appear on your screen shortly after you submit. You can download a PDF to follow along with today's webinar by clicking on that handouts icon labeled here with this bottom arrow that should be located on the right-hand side of your screen. Click there and you should be able to grab a PDF to follow along for today. Today's webinar is being recorded. You're going to receive a link to that recording in a follow-up email, so please allow a couple business days before that information is sent. In that same email, you'll receive your HRCI and SHRM certification codes along with another link to the PDF. So today we have a webinar titled Microlearning, Are You Doing It Right? And our speakers today, you can see them there. We have Salomonsen, the Chief Learning Officer from Grovo, and Tom Tonkin, the Principal Consultant, Thought Leadership and Advisory Services at Cornerstone OnDemand. As Chief Learning Officer at Grovo, Summer spearheads the company's microlearning content and professional services capabilities, leading Grovo's content strategy, learning experience, and design teams to continuously grow its adaptable and customizable microlearning library. Tom is an executive in professional services and software sales arena and has over 25 years of business and technology experience. He's currently serving, as I said, as principal consultant, change management, and thought leadership and advisory services with Cornerstone OnDemand. So it is my pleasure to have both Summer and Tom with us. So without any further delay, Tom, let's get started.
Excellent. Thank you, Alec. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I got to tell you, I'm sort of extra excited about this particular webinar. You know, it's going to be informative, educational, and hopefully a little entertaining to pass your day along. So I cherish everybody's time today, and we have the star of the show, Summer, who is going to talk a lot about what we do with microlearning. But before we get started, I wanted to sort of lay this foundation out a little bit on the actual presentation that we're going to go through. And I'll give everybody a little bit of a preamble. So it's going to be a little different in the sense of it's going to be very conversational. As you can imagine, we've already done a little bit of rehearsing and making sure we understand what kind of the topic we're going to do. But I'm going to tell you right now, there's no script. It's going to be very much off the cuff of our experience, which makes it pretty exciting. We believe that we have a fairly interesting agenda lined up for you. But if we don't, meaning if there's something that you find that we're not answering, please jot that down. So let me encourage everybody right now, take a minute to grab a paper, pencil, or something to write something down as you go. Maybe you have a question. I know that I usually tend to talk a little bit about some other outside references that you might want to connect to. And you want to go ahead and take the opportunity here, make this your webinar. So without any further ado, actually today's March 8th, and today is International Women's Day. So all of you women, including Summer, congratulations. Is in order. Yay for International Women's Day. But what I think I wanted to bring in from a current events perspective, it was very interesting. We're going to talk about a lot about microlearning, but I read, I think it was last week, I think it was March 2nd, if I get my dates right, Josh Burson, who happens to know a little bit about the space, was writing about, the sort of the red hot economy and what is HR going to do about it. And halfway through it, started talking about some of the solutions and the number one solution sort of approach or strategy that we're going to talk about is this idea of microlearning. So it's very top of mind. And so let's get through the agenda very quickly. Let's get Summer involved here. We're going to talk about microlearning, what it is, what it's not. I find it interesting sometimes if you go to Google and you type in microlearning, and you want to get all this information, you get a bunch of stuff. Is it microspace learning, micro-dash learning? Is it all one word? It's really starting to formalize itself. We're going to talk about some of the successes and pitfalls on what it is, what it isn't. And Summer's going to walk us through creating a micro-learning strategy, which is already a hint as to what microlearning may actually be. So let's get started. So, Summer, microlearning. We hear it all the time, and I want to sort of maybe demystify things or talk about it. Tell us what microlearning really is.
I couldn't agree with you more, Tom. I think everyone's talking about this, right? It is a word du jour in learning and development, but I think it's right on that cliff of becoming a buzzword du jour. Yeah. And so hopefully today we can pull it back from that precipice and give it some gravitas, because I believe there's meat there. At Grovo, we would define microlearning as a modern approach to workplace learning that delivers targeted lessons to employees in their workflows so that they can learn behaviors over time. And I think there's three critical components to that, and we'll unpack it today. But really, one, microlearning at its core, and the name micro is around single concept learning. It's around identifying very specific behaviors and skills to target. But the second piece, and I've been really interested to see Josh Burson as well as Bob Mosier talk about this recently in the CLO magazine article around workflow learning, that learning can no longer be this external construct that we remove employees from their job to learn. We need to get smart and strategic with how we integrate learning into workflows. And so I'd love to talk about microlearning in that capacity today.
Yeah. Let's tease that out ever so slightly more. The idea of the workflow, because I think it's a nuance, but it's a big difference in that sense. I mean, nuance in the sense of how it's described. Just take us one step further into that workflow as it pertains to a microlearning strategy.
Absolutely. So when I think of workflow, there's two components to this. And I often use the term contextual relevance to really define this. So the microlearning content in and of itself has got to be highly relevant to learners, meaning that it's reflective of the work they do. Anything less is not going to be effective. But the workflow learning, what's most powerful about this is that we're kind of upending this expectation that L&D is ancillary or looking from the outside in. We need to integrate with organizational strategy and provide learners opportunity to learn when they need it. And what we find in microlearning, our customers especially, when they target lessons to learners and workflows, it has a multiple hundreds% chance of being received better because we've aligned it with, I took a new job, I'm managing a new scope, I just missed my quotas for the quarter. How can I move my skill level up in certain areas? So that contextual relevance is really critical to workflow learning.
It's interesting you mentioned again. This is a little bit of the sort of the synapses firing in my brain when Summer's talking about it. I remember this was a little bit of an ancillary discussion. This idea of, let's say you're in deep work, and I think it's Cal Newport's book on deep work. Right, that talks about this idea that if I'm in deep work and all of a sudden, something notification shoots across my screen that says, you got an email from somebody, and you switch over to that email, I think the average to sort of get you back into that zone is 22 minutes.
Yep.
And so I think we could say the same thing here, right? We could say that if I'm doing some deep work or any kind of work, and now I have to disengage from that to go learn something, ancillary, right? It's going to break that up and ends up actually that 22 minutes has to come from somewhere. And it usually comes from your productivity or lack thereof.
Well, and imagine that 22 minutes, the now infamous infographic of the modern learner, right?
Yes.
This fierce competition for time. Everybody's seen it, but essentially Burson by Deloitte distilled down to the modern worker has 24 minutes a week to apply to learning. If we're distracting or we're applying learning in a way that's not integrated, then they're going to waste that time just trying to conceptualize what they are learning. We need to offer immersive opportunities.
Yeah, I want to go back to what you just said. So Summer is alluding to a infographic that came out from Burst, I think it's 2015, in which it went back and dissected, what's the actual learning environment. It's one thing to sort of put it on a piece of paper to say, here's what we're expecting you to do. What's actually happening? It came back to say it was 4.8 minutes a day that learning was actually taking place. Now, I have a different spin on that, and Summer knows this. I think sometimes all of a sudden we think of 4.8. Now we got to cram everything into 5 minutes chunks, which is where it takes me to the other side of the screen, which is what micro learning is not.
Yeah.
And so, Summer, I hope I set you up on that one to talk about what micro learning is not.
It is not. And I think as practitioners, we're gaining knowledge in this area, right? I just worked with eLearning Guild about a month ago to put out their kind of state of microlearning report. And I would say across the board, the different thought leaders they interviewed, we all agree, microlearning is not a 20-minute video that you have made into 5-minute video chunks. Like all virtual learning experiences, creating it is its own translation process. It's never a one-for-one. One of the things my team often says, and I'm inspired by this, when we target lessons to create for our library, it's not the size of the lesson, it's the size of the idea that we focus on. Brevity is implicit in a microlearning design because we realize competition for time is fierce, but we need to do the hard work of distilling out all the peripheral stuff that we believe must be part of that experience to get to the pith.
Yeah, let's hammer that home one more time, because I think that's a real problem. Is micro means small, therefore, right? Everything I consume is small, and I like that that description when you say it's not the size, but it's the size of the idea is where you actually have that design. You don't take something big and chop it up. I mean, as a matter of fact, that's probably one of the worst things you could do, is to take something that has designed for, say, 2 hours. Let's just get to the ridiculous. And for the next month, you're going to eat this thing, 3 minutes at a time, to assume that at the end of all of these 3-minute chunks, anything, rather than have sit in front of a computer for or whatever for 2 hours. It's just ridiculous. I don't know another topic. And yet there's a lot of folks, I think, because of that precipice, I like the wording you used, around this idea of it turning into a buzzword, and all of a sudden the meaning just gets sucked out of it.
I agree. And I think the word you use is so critical, Tom, the design. As L&D practitioners, we've had this long history of spending a lot of time designing the learning that we present. And I think one of our biggest Achilles heels is over-architecting learning. We kind of get so caught up in maybe our own brilliance, but maybe our own passion around all the different ways that our learning responds to the best learning theory and promotes the best learning design principles. But are we staying focused on, is this just what my employees need? And when we talk about a strategy, that's where this is going to be incumbent upon us to say, hey, sometimes it's simpler than we think. We are focusing on an idea rather than clouding it with a bunch of other stuff.
I'm going to jump to another resource. So there's another great book by the Heath brothers called Make It Stick. And in there, they talk about this notion of the curse of knowledge. And I'm going to put myself and Summer into this problem bucket, which is sometimes we just don't know everything we know. And we then make an unconscious assumption that everybody we talk to knows what we know. And it's not a expertise thing necessarily. It's just the world we live in. I mean, Summer's the CLO at Grovo. That's what she does most of the day. And I get paid to think about these kinds of things. That's what I do most of the day. So when somebody walks down the street and says, hey, tell me a little bit about microlearning, we could fall into the problem of just busting out all the buzzwords. And so so in summary, as to move this along, microlearning is a strategy, folks. and we're going to get an opportunity to unpack how we can create a strategy. It's not a bunch of broken pieces made up into small chunks that you can fit in 4.8 minutes a day. That's the summary of the slide. But I want to get to the catalyst discussion here, which is we've talked about what it is and what it isn't, but somewhere along the line, these things don't usually appear because it's a good idea or somebody had a wonderful thought, right? It appeared because our organizations are changing. Yeah. The learning paradigms are changing. The value of learning, I'm going to say, us learning and development types, the screws are getting put to us in the sense that we're trying to manufacture high potential, better people to perform. Yeah. And so Summer, take us down a journey of what's the catalyst for us to start thinking this way.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the right question to ask, because if we're going to say that microlearning is more than just a buzzword or a shiny thing, then we need to have some meat behind it. And what I find is, as practitioners, we're diligent in reading all the research reports. I mean, I'm first in line. Whenever a person drops a new report, state of the industry, where's HR and L&D going, we're looking at the data. But I think oftentimes we're not coming to the right conclusions. And from a microlearning strategy perspective, there's two major buckets that I tend to focus on as the significant drivers for this strategy. And the first is the changing dynamics of employees. Okay, and at the risk of this, dissolving into a discussion of millennials or Gen Xers, bottom line is, when you look at Pew Research, when you look at Gallup, when you look at even US Census data, generations in the workplace that are dominating now, by 2025, it'll be predominantly Gen Xers and millennials, they tend to move between jobs more frequently. Okay, this isn't a qualitative statement, it's just a data statement. So when you have an employee base that shifts between places of work, L&D has a problem. We need to be able to upskill them faster, get them to competency quicker, and we also need to determine how do we retain the knowledge they learn, disseminate it in the workplace to make sure that when people do leave, we aren't losing significant parts of our processes. So that employee piece is one big piece. The other piece is really just the changing workplace. And here, buzzword alert, I'm going to throw some down, but I think they're important. We talk about things like digital transformation, business model innovation, and we throw these words around, but what it really means is companies are shifting. Marketplaces have become more aggressive, and they need to relook at how they do business, which means they need to put people in positions of influence without authority. It means teams are doing work across teams as opposed to traditional, more hierarchical structures where I rely on my title in order to get things done. So this points to a need to upskill quicker and to develop a strategy that responds to these shifts. So that's where microlearning comes in for me.
I have to add another one. So you're talking about data, and yeah, I'm unfortunately fall into the data junkie camp. As far as books and articles, there's literally a brand new research. Actually, it turned it into a book from Barna Research, and it literally came out, I think, like a month ago, and it was Generation Z, and it's 19 years old and younger. And they came up with themes, and they have a new tagline, which is so appropriate. This idea that they're called screen agers. And they talk about the fact that 57% of this group spends at least 4 hours a day in front of a screen. And so, okay, we talk about them as being screen agers, but guess what, folks? 5 years from now, like Summer said, they're probably going to be knocking on your front door, looking for some employment, and they'll have an expectation going into that. And I think we have to be prepared.
You're absolutely right. That expectation is the key word, Tom. I think as L&D professionals, we need to expect that our employees expect real learning opportunities.
Right.
And if we're seeing it any differently, we're missing the point.
Yeah, I concur. So we have to wrap up and summarize this slide is there's this catalyst of flatter organizations, this sort of changing learning paradigms because the organizations and employees are changing, and the value of learning is getting teased out in such a way that the expectations are such that I want to be developed as an employee, and hence that's where my satisfaction will stem. That's where my tenure and my retention will stem from. So, but I want to bring us now to the next topic here, which is anytime you bring a new word in, such as microlearning, you fear that there's something different that is happening, something that I now have to learn different, or is it approached differently, or was I doing it wrong before? Maybe I should have been doing microlearning 50 years ago. Can you let's talk a little bit about the yin and yang, for lack of a better term, on the slide on where does microlearning fit versus traditional learning? Where is it symbiotic? Where is it similar? Where is it different?
Yeah, I love this slide. And I think it's always a risk to say this newest strategy now unseats or upends everything that has come before it. And we know that would be foolish to say. As we just laid out, this is a strategy that responds to what we see in the workplace. So it's a smart way to deliver real learning. But as an L&D professional, as someone who loves this industry, real learning will always be real learning. We will always fall back to what we know to be true about how learners engage with content and what piques interest and what moves learners to emotions of curiosity and delight. Those things will always have prevalence in what we design. But I think for me, microlearning then becomes a component of the overarching strategy to say, yes, for some employees, I want to bring them in. We want to do in person. We want immersive peer groups. I want to do blended learning for others. I want to try flipped classrooms with different types of teams. But microlearning is most effective when you're targeting a very specific skill, and you maybe don't have the luxury to pull people out of what they're doing. You need them upskilled quickly. So it blends in with the natural flow of work and doesn't disrupt learning in that sense.
Yeah, I want to make sure we go back to that. So that was a little bit of that, what microlearning is, and that it being a strategy. And again, I go back to that. I love that idea you bring up around workflow, right? The idea that we don't want to depart from what we're doing. As a matter of fact, we're feeling the need to know something. We don't know it. It introduces itself at that right time, which again, I would suggest that is a little bit of the difference, if you will, in microlearning implementation versus, say, traditional learning, where you're taken out of the environment and put into a situation, right? So that's why I see we see this. This chart, the way we've written it is there's some differences and some similarities, but I think it'll always be rooted in traditional learning. I want to bring up something you just said, which was the idea of curiosity. And we talked about screen agers, we talk about technology. We know that the sale of books are dropping, not necessarily because people are not necessarily reading they're just not reading. And partially because they're in front of their screens consuming whatever social media content. One of the things that I did as part of sort of overall research, and I'll get your thought on this, is there's a feature on Google. Google's got all these interesting little features. It's called the Ngram view. And what it is you can type in a word or a phrase, and it goes and searches all of this text all the way back to the 1800s. Everything that they have online, and shows you the use of the word. And I did that for curiosity. And I hate to say this, and I'm going to report this, that the word curiosity has steadily declined since the 1800s. It's a graph that's just going down from the top left to the bottom right. And that's to your point, is sort of that spark of learning that, by the way, is not circumvented by microlearning, but actually taken advantage of by microlearning. And I think we need to continue to do that. Go ahead.
No, I think it's incumbent upon us to build that into any type of content we create. I've been looking at the work of Annie Murphy Paul lately on academic emotions and challenging my team to think about how are we creating microlearning content that builds a learner's curiosity for what they're going to experience. That is incumbent upon us. That is our hard work to do. And we see, microlearning in practice is more engaging because we are distilling down to what is essential. It's the size of the idea, not of the lesson. So when you give a learner, an employee, an opportunity to deep dive into a single concept, into one thing that has either been alerted to them they need, or they have discovered through the library, or however that happens, you are increasing the chance that they're going to see it to the end.
So I want to quick summarize. So there's sound bites that are coming out of here that I want to make sure everybody catches. All right, the size of the idea is a really good one. That microlearning is a strategy, that it's not bits of a larger thing. These are all little sound bites that are coming out of this webinar. Hopefully everybody's jotting down. Maybe you've got some questions on it. But I'm going to make the assumption that if you're still with us and you're tracking with everything that we're doing, that you're probably saying, okay, guys, I get it. This is a good thing. We want to move on. Tell me a little bit about the benefits. Tell me how I now start introducing what's going on. So there are people out there, right, some that are doing microlearning. What are the benefits that some of these folks are reaping, if you will?
I think when it's done right, you're looking at a quicker, agile development process. One of the things that I have been focused on intently the last year studying is how we can appropriate agile methodologies into content creation, moving away from very threshold focused waterfall ADDIE model. I'm sorry, we gotta come up with a hybrid in creating more iterative fashion so that we can more rapidly produce the content, but also improve it through design. So I think that 300% faster to develop is part of that. When you're focused on a single concept and you have deliberately weeded out the extras. I was recently in Dallas doing one of our lunch and microlearn sessions with a local business, and they had utilized a microlearning strategy to upend their onboarding program. And my colleague had started calling it the stop talking approach. He said, we realized the onboarding had just become this noise. And so I was telling my colleagues, just stop talking. Like, we need to stop talking and actually have a conversation about what is it that we're trying to communicate to new hires? What is that actually? Because I think as we get involved with companies and as we kind of settle into our roles, we take for granted so many things that don't have to be there, aren't critical, aren't necessary. So I'd say that kind of quicker to develop, that ability to kind of weed out extraneous things. But then the engagement rates is what's most powerful here. So at Grovo, we've been tracking our library over the past several months, and we look at assigned content trends in this 93 to 95%. That's slightly higher than what I'm looking at now, but around 95% completion, which is pretty respectable for assigned content. But the real value is unassigned. When learners have an opportunity to engage in real microlearning lessons that spark curiosity and are immersive, we find that lessons that learners just click on their own, 76% completed. Meaning, I went into this, I discovered something new. 76% of the time, they saw it to completion. That's exciting to an L&D practitioner.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's such a simple way to describe this. If you ever go to, say, a YouTube channel, I'm a big YouTube person. I am domestically challenged, so my wife asks me to do things, simple things.
Yes.
YouTube becomes my friend, right? So I go to YouTube, and it's the guy changing, the filter in something, whatever. And I'll go to the channel, and you'll see the videos, but you know how in YouTube they got the little tag at the bottom that tells you how long the video is going to be? I don't think it's a big surprise, but it's always nice evidence to say, guess what? The shorter videos have more views than the longer videos.
True.
Now the question, right? So now the question becomes, how effective is that video for me to be able to figure out how to solve, the filter? And I think that in layman's term is what we're looking for. We're looking for that digestible single idea content. I'm going to show you how to change the filter. That's all I'm going to show you how to do, but you're going to be able to do it really, really well, and you'll win points with your wife. that's what I'm looking for, and I think that's what we're talking about here. And so now what I want to do is I want to pivot the conversation a little bit, and let's start talking about strategies here, right? And the way we could start doing that is by identifying the successes and the pitfalls of implementation. So what I want you to do here for us, Summer, is so you're working with lots of different customers. You're doing a lot of this stuff today, and you're seeing some of the successes and potentially some of the, let's say, opportunities, not so many pitfalls. Walk us through what are the characteristics or traits of successful utilization, shall I say, of the strategy versus potentially ones that are not as successful?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest traits we see is customers that have an idea in mind. So they've already thought about a microlearning strategy and are saying, Grovo, we want to use this content to target this specific thing. And I think that's true for a lot of L&D strategies and solutions. When we're creating L&D strategies for things that we either haven't targeted or don't necessarily exist, or we're responding to symptoms of things, it's going to be far less successful than when we take the time to actually pinpoint what the problem is. So companies that we've worked with that have done this the best have said, we have this very specific employee need. We worked with an international hospitality chain that said, hey, we're noticing that customers are doing a lot of their own problem solving online. So by the time they call our call center, they have really complex questions to ask our people, which means that they're staying on the phone a whole lot longer. And in some cases, they're not even sure how to answer these things. So they used a microlearning strategy to say, how can we upskill people faster when they first come into this job? And how can we focus their onboarding on the more complex problems as opposed to taking weeks and weeks and weeks on the very simple questions, you know, hours of operation, or what countries are your hotels in, or whatever the case may be. And what they found is after they applied this microlearning strategy, they cut down their time to competency from 5 weeks to 2.
Wow.
So people were, it's more than 60%, they were on the phones, ready to answer the more complex question. And that goes exactly to your point, Tom. Yep. We are seeing a shift in consumers and learners that we're willing to find out a lot of stuff on our own. I don't necessarily need my company to give me trainings on email.
So it's interesting you say that, because again, stuff firing into my head here is the CEB, right? The conference board, right? They published this about 2 years ago, where customers were 57% of customers were ready to buy by the time they first talked to their salespeople, because right, they've done all this homework, right? They went and did all these internet searches and learned about a bunch of stuff. And so all of a sudden they're ready to buy, but the questions that they had before they actually purchased were very detailed, very complex. And yet here we are at a somewhat of a disadvantage. So just like Dan Pink's book, right? The To Sell is Human. He's got a great quote which he switches. Back in the old days, it's buyer beware. Now it's seller beware, right? Because our buyers, our customers, our purchasers, all this other stuff, those that are having customer facing companies, you're getting really, really smart customers and prospects coming to you. And so then how can you quickly, to Summer's point, respond to those changing needs? So now I'm going to go ask you, and I know a lot of people are out there probably thinking to themselves, okay, so you just said some large international hospitality. Sounds to me like this microlearning stuff is probably for big companies only.
Oh, yeah. Funny you would say that. I'd say it's for all size companies, okay? The point is being deliberate in choosing your strategy. And that's for any type of L&D strategy. As practitioners, we need to take the time, the pause to say, what problem am I solving? And am I applying the right strategy to this? And what microlearning does from the get-go is it assumes that you are looking at a challenge that is distinct, that is unique. You want to look at a problem and solve it in a different way. So instead of saying, hey, we're going to cram one more thing into the onboarding program, you're saying, hey, this is mission critical, and we need a new strategy to address this quickly. I mean, I can give you other examples, but one that comes to mind is actually a utility company Smaller in size, really regional focused. And imagine this, they have roughly 500 to 600 field operatives. So these are the folks that go out into the field, repair power lines. They're doing a lot of manual in the field work. And yet they found that their training was falling down in a very critical area, which was when certain things broke or when certain things needed fixing, the ways that these repairmen were able to find that information was super complex, taking up to an hour to 2 hours to flip through hard-coded manuals, calling in on the walkies, and they tabulated this cost saying every time 600 of our repairmen take an hour to find a problem, it cost the company $20,000.
Wow.
That's the loss of revenue. That is your prime opportunity for a microlearning strategy. You have a very specific point of need. You have a very specific skill you need to improve. And so they started targeting very, very specific, I'm going to keep saying that word, but very specific training through a microlearning strategy so that as part of their day, they were being reinforced and were able to practice these very critical skills.
That's fascinating because it's 600 people, rather a smaller size company that can see a $20,000 gain at an hour like that. It sort of obviously pays for itself in the long run. Before I move on to sort of the critical steps, it's one thing to sort of roll out an implementation and people think when they're implementing something, they're sort of on their way, but potentially they may be implementing something from a sort of a faulty theoretical model below. Can you give us some characteristics from a pitfall perspective to say you may be thinking about this wrong before you implement? We talked a little bit about the video thing, right? What other ideas do you have potentially coming in from an incorrect position?
I think you're thinking about this wrong if you're not understanding that a strategy is a strategy is a strategy. It means you start it, you deploy it, and you see it to its completion. I think a microlearning strategy, like other L&D strategies, assumes that you have done the requisite research, you've been rigorous in identifying what is really the problem. I think we fall victim to that a lot in L&D. We feel pain points, and instead of pausing to validate they're the real source of the issue, we react and we propose solutions that aren't going to solve them in the long run. I think oftentimes as well, people assume that if you build it, they'll come. And we know that's not true. If we build it, they don't come. They don't ever come. We have to work really, really hard, building contextual base, doing an awesome Marcom plan around what we create to drive traffic to our solutions. That is always going to be implicit in this type of strategy.
Yeah, I want to go back to your example of the utility because you said that they had a perspective on that gap, right? Mm-hmm. That they knew that this particular in that workflow, again, going back to that great example of that within the workflow, they had a slice where it just wasn't there. So having that awareness alone, I think, is important. People would say, well, here's my learning strategy. I now am going to band-aid it with some micro-learning. Yeah. May not necessarily be the right way.
Give them training, they'll be better.
Yeah, exactly. Training is good. Training is good. Okay, so now people are going, okay, guys, I bought in. Give me some ideas on where to start. So you said a strategy is a strategy is a strategy. So we're going to cash that check right now and talk a little bit about what it is that we can do to roll out a microlearning strategy. Let's start with step one. You say start small. What's small mean?
So we're using that word again, right? I mean, it's a microlearning strategy. So we gotta start micro. But I think the most effective deployment of a microlearning strategy means you have rigorously identified the behavioral issue, the skill gap, the problem that is holding your company back from achieving its goals. I would add to this that this has always got to be aligned with your organizational mission and your organizational focus. So some companies might realize, hey, when we promote individuals into leadership, which all companies do it, we promote them because they're really good at the skills they have, but then suddenly they're managing teams and they stink at it, right? So they're looking at a very specific skill gap of within the first 3 months of moving leaders into this role, we're seeing, increase in complaints, we're seeing higher attrition, we're seeing projects stalled or not getting completed, based on typical early manager problems, right? First-time managers, I'm over managing, I'm trying to do it all myself, I don't know how to delegate, I'm using my title to influence rather than my, being a part of the team. Yeah, it goes on and on.
Yep.
So I'd say to start small assumes that you have identified that issue and you've taken the step to make sure it is the issue. What I've utilized throughout my career is I always go back to the 5 whys. We hear about this, of course, made famous by Toyota and their lean methodology. It's the successive questioning of why a certain thing is the way it is in order to get back to the root. Doesn't always have to be 5. Sometimes it's faster. But I find that this activity is best done in a group setting as well, to validate that you're doing the successive questioning and you are honestly answering those whys. Why are leaders struggling in these roles when they first come into those positions? It's easy to put the blame on someone else.
Yeah, I'm gonna categorize this step as just not necessarily just a microlearning strategy, but just a learning strategy that happens to be implemented through a microlearning strategy. The classic example that always comes to my mind is the promotion of, say, salespeople to sales management. And so usually what happens is that usually it's the best sales guy, right? The one that actually has closed the most business is the one that somehow gets promoted to becoming a manager, where the skill is to actually sell, but the sales manager's skill is to manage, which are arguably different skills. And so there's an instant gap in that process. Now, mind you, microlearning is one of the ways you can close that gap. There's probably all sorts of other ways to do that. But knowing that, right? Knowing that you have that gap is important. Let's go to step number 2, which is this idea of stay. So we're started small. We've maybe taken small amounts, a small set of ideas, and now you're suggesting that we need to stay focused. What are we staying focused on?
I think this is where, as practitioners, and especially a microlearning strategy, is most vulnerable to being overtaken by what I call also-rans. You've laid out your microlearning strategy, you've targeted that skill that you want to improve, and maybe you've gotten funding, maybe you're starting to create content, maybe you've pitched it to your executive team, and all of a sudden people start attaching their objectives onto your strategy. So they're like, hey, that's fantastic. While you do that, can you also add on the requisite OSHA thing? Because we got to get that out to managers this quarter, okay? And I get there are business imperatives around that, but a microlearning strategy is most powerful, as we talked about before, when you can focus on that single concept, when you're integrating it into workflows, and you're keeping it contextually relevant. So as a strategy, it is vulnerable to those kind of competing priorities. And this is where I'm thinking back to my consultant days, where I would encourage people to anticipate the pushback, anticipate those priorities that are going to knock your strategy sideways, and learn to make the case for the skill you've identified. Why is it so business critical? Put that into words so that you can maintain that throughout the stages.
Yeah, I think that there's probably all sorts of extra words that we can use, like scope creep and different, what is it? What's the saying? Success has many parents, failures are orphans, or something like that, right? So we all kind of want to jump into the success of a program.
Yes.
So, right. So we're going to start small. We've got a focused idea. And finally, this idea of making it stick, which I'm not necessarily really clear on that. Why don't you, what are we making stick actually in this process?
So I've seen this step as kind of twofold. One, you want to make sure that the learning sticks, okay? And this is paramount. Okay. How you've created the content, how you've delivered it, workflows again, yep. But also ensuring that you've given your learners an opportunity to practice, to reinforce, because you want to see those skills changed. That is the point. The point of learning is change. So you're targeting transfer, you're targeting contextual learning. So that's one component of it. But the other component, and what I've been really passionate about recently, is ways that we as L&D practitioners can develop our respective organizations as learning cultures. Until we get to that place, that learning is seen as something that is a value, an objective. Working in a learning culture means that employees have the opportunity to make mistakes. They have the opportunity to learn from them. There's kind of a creative tension. I've been looking back at some of the early work of Peter Senge and the fifth principle, and thinking about managers' role in this position as a teacher and a steward. And more recently, I've been looking at some of Josh Berson's kind of learning and development maturity models, thinking about how we can best position the work we do in organizations to beyond this just check the box reactive to really embedding a learning culture at our companies.
Yeah, for those that are keeping track and on our program, Peter Senge is great author of the fifth discipline, talks about learning organizations and 8 different archetypes. It's just a seminal book for anybody in L&D needs to have on their shelf. So in summary, right, we're talking about starting small in this case, a piece of the learning, and that, I mean that in the larger scale. Staying focused on that gap, we talked about it, that workflow, that gap in that workflow, which is so essential. And then finally, making that learning stick, right? We're trying to change the associated behaviors to that. Excellent. So as I look at the time at the clock, I want to make sure we have time for any kinds of questions that may come our way. But in quick summary, we talked about the advent of microlearning and where it is, the catalyst, the fact that work is changing. We happen to be, according to the World Economic Forum, we happen to be in the 4th Industrial Revolution, which is including all sorts of interesting paradigms to the learning space, probably more so than any once in our lifetime, actually, that particular change. We know that microlearning has great benefits. It's rooted in traditional learning. There are successful situations. There are also pitfalls and characteristics. And we went to the 3 steps of starting small, stay focused, and making it stick. So with that, I hope that we've given you a primer, if you will, an introduction to microlearning. I'm going to take time right now to thank Summer for her time and her intellect on all of this, her focus. And Alec, I'd like to turn it over back to you to see if we have any questions from the folks.
All right, Tom, thank you. Thank you to you as well, Summer. We have questions in the queue already, but if you have a question, please don't hesitate to submit it in by clicking on that Q&A icon. Just type it in and click submit there. We're going to start with one from Cynthia, and I'm going to start off with you on this one, Summer. Cynthia's question is, where is it appropriate to implement micro-learning, and where isn't it? Is onboarding a good example for this?
That's a great question, Cynthia, and actually, I think onboarding is a prime example for this. Yeah. I've recently been talking to a couple customers and also professional colleagues about the need to rethink the onboarding cadence and the scope of onboarding. And I'm referencing my colleague in Dallas again with his stop talking technique. But he realized that their onboarding had become so overwhelmed by just a series of people walking into a room talking about a subject. So new hires are sitting down, as a lot of onboarding practices happen, and the legal counsel would come in, and then the marketing guy, and then the whoever gal, and they would talk about what they do, and the people would politely nod. And he said after he started observing this, as he came into the role, he realized there has got to be a better way to do this. So the first step was really critically looking at, what do employees really got to know in those first few months? And maybe it's not a message from the legal counsel. Maybe it's not a primer on our external marketing. You have to make that decision for your company. But in his case, the microlearning strategy was most needed in that onboarding, also to gain their employees' trust, because he found that because that was their first experience with learning at their company, anything else successive that they rolled out lost credibility, because they remember how long they sat in that room listening to people talk. So I like that concept of using a microlearning strategy to rebuild that trust, to make sure, hey, we're feeding you learning that's going to improve your work and help you upskill and not waste your time.
I'd like to add some language. So now that we've gone through this microlearning part of that microlearning strategy has to be applied to a problem, right? This is a solution. This shouldn't be a solution or a answer looking for a question, right? We have to sort of understand the question first. And for Cynthia, think about this. There's actually 3 phases to this onboarding thing that I think we all throw in together. First, there's this idea of orientation, like where am I and what do I need to know, just like Summer said. Then there's onboarding, right, which is sort of more the practices of your job. And then there's this idea of acculturation, right? So am I going to be acculturated into the company itself, which usually takes longer. These are 3 phases of what everybody lumps in as onboarding, and there's a mindset for each one of those things. And I'm going to suggest that microlearning can probably play a spot in each one of those phases.
Nice. Love it, Tom.
Yes.
All right. Thank you both for that. Quickly, we had a few people ask, can you say the name of the author and that book that was mentioned right at the end there?
Yeah, Peter Senge. And it's the 5th discipline. But I would also recommend an article that came out in the MIT Sloan Review from 1990 by Peter Senge on how to build a learning organization.
Yeah.
And that, I will tell you, because it's one of my favorite articles, my favorite quote from him is, over the long run, superior learning, superior performance depends upon superior learning. That's been a call to action for my team. Over the long run, superior performance depends upon superior learning. Nice. What's up, Tom?
Let it not be said, we're not a full service webinar. Awesome. We're going to stick with you on this, Tom, actually. This next one comes from Gary. Gary's question is, microlearning seems perfect for task-specific knowledge and technical skills building, but what about soft skills learning? Is there a place for microlearning when building soft skills such as communication, emotional intelligence, and leadership skills?
There absolutely is. This is a little bit of my sweet spot. It's funny. I wrote an article for the Workplace Solutions Review, and when it comes to learning, the people say hard skills and soft skills. I basically say hard skills and difficult skills, because I think the soft skills are really the quote unquote harder, more difficult, in the sense that there's so much more emotional intelligence behind it, and it's not necessarily based on fact. However, it can be learned. If you take a look at things like skills, abilities, knowledge, attitudes, these are all things that actually can change, which means they can be learned. And so, for example, let's take a soft skill such as leadership. Boy, talk about leadership. I mean, that's a massive term. But in that massive term, there are ideas. They're smaller. So let's take the next level lower, which might be servant leadership, which takes a little bit of that leadership and says, basically, it's based on Robert Greenleaf's view of leadership called Servant as Leader. It's an essay in 1970 that he published and now is turned into a strategy of leadership itself. It has certain tenets, and actually I think it was Larry Spears that basically came up with these 10 principles of servant leadership. Okay, maybe you're good at 8 of those things, and you need some help on those 2. It goes right back to what Summer said is, let's not look at the size of the training, let's look at the size of the idea. And there's absolutely no reason why those 2 things that particular person may need in servant leadership couldn't be addressed through microlearning. The same could be said for any other large topic of soft skills. Negotiation. Negotiation is another really good one. It's really, really big. Part of negotiation is objection handling. Part of objection handling is a skill around persuasion of that objection. Boom, there you have it. Size of the idea, something that's easily consumed through microlearning in a very effective way. But I want to give Summer a few minutes on this as well.
Oh, I love it. I'm sitting here going, yeah. You know, if this was a virtual thing, I'd be liking what you just said, Tom. Um, I think one of the things I'd love to propose, since we have, you know, the movers and shakers on this webinar, let's start calling soft skills professional skills, because that's what they are. We all need them. They are requisite to the work we do. But back to what you were saying, one of our biggest drivers in our library is thinking about this leadership skill set. And within our leadership collection, we break it down for the learner. And I think what's powerful about microlearning is they shouldn't have to do all that work. They shouldn't have to interpret what we are trying to train them on. They shouldn't have to decipher 8 hours of people talking to think, what are really the takeaways here? Microlearning is powerful because you give them that single concept, that negotiation, that influencing without authority, that working across teams, to say, this is the skill, this is what you're going to immerse in, and this is what you're going to apply. And that's how change happens.
All right, moving along. We still have a little bit of time. I'll send this one to you, Summer, to start us off. This comes from Natalie. When you blend microlearning into the workflow, how can you also work to make it more learner-driven, constructivist styled, so that learning isn't something that's happening to them, but rather something that they do?
Oh, I love that, Natalie. What a brilliantly asked question. And
Well
that's
done.
the word du jour, right? How can we take learning that we are creating as practitioners and make it grassroots as part of something that they do? I think one of the biggest things I would say is give your learners an opportunity to peer learn, to share, to assign, to say, hey, I'd love for you guys to check this out, just like we do with the articles that we read. One of my favorite things is getting a hit up on LinkedIn from a colleague saying, hey, Summer, I read something that you should take a look at. I know you're going to love this. So moving away from that kind of over-architected top-down view of learning and recognizing that learning now is fluid, is learner-driven. Because if it's not going to be powerful. Tom, I'm sure you have thoughts on this.
No, the thing that popped into my head is when I'm sure we've all have purchased a car, especially a used car, and maybe you purchase it from that guy in the corner who says, "Summer, what's it going to take to put you in this car?" When someone says that to me, that just completely turns me off. Right? Don't do anything to me. And unfortunately, there's a whole bunch of learning strategies that we're doing stuff to people, and so the idea is, how can you then create a collaborative situation where people learn? I speak a lot about self-directed learning, and there are basically four skills that one has to improve to become more self-directed. One of them is interpersonal communication. And the reason you want to have good interpersonal communication is we think of learning as reading a text, watching a video, but the other really powerful thing is talking to someone else. That person is a resource themselves, and that certainly can be part of your micro-learning strategy. And again, I'm trying to stay out of the systematic discussion for now, but that could be a wonderful way to incorporate micro-learning. To Summer's point, right? Someone says, "Oh, I know Summer's interested in micro-learning. I just read this article. She may or may not have seen it. I'm going to go send it to her." Guess what? Summer's about to learn something. And hopefully good micro-learning strategy has been used for that particular article, which hopefully we've done here in this webinar as well. I think Summer would agree.
You know, I'll add to that, Tom. Natalie, one final thing you might think about is challenge yourself to position the learning that's offered to your employees as something that is iterative and something that is growing.
Yeah.
So it's not this finalized, constructed thing you're consuming. And it's not just the, requisite survey at the end of the onboarding, but help us brainstorm ways to keep this flowing, to apply that agile mindset to how we create learning in order to achieve greater innovation and not see things as I've created onboarding and now it's done.
Yep.
All right. Unfortunately, that's going to be all the time we have. We have a ton of questions in the queue. Wish we had time to answer them all, but we don't today. So Tom and Summer, thank you so much for that presentation. I also want to thank everybody on the line. Like I said, we had a ton of people submitting in there. Your participation is greatly appreciated. And Tom and Summer, did you have something here on this slide that you want to talk to?
No, just want to let you know that we do have a partnership, obviously, between Cornerstone and Grovo. That's why we work closely together. And if anything is more interesting, if some of these questions are burning, I mean, it's fairly easy to find us virtually online. We're not here to hide from anybody. We're just running out of time. And so if you've got a question, you can email us or tweet at us, or you'll find us. We're out there.
Tweet at us.
All right. Well, great. Again, thank you to Tom and Summer. Thank you to all of our attendees. And I want to thank Cornerstone OnDemand for sponsoring today's webinar. It's always a pleasure to work with the folks there. So thanks again, everybody. We'll see you all back here for our next Chief Learning Officer webinar, and you can find that information at clomedia.com/webinars. So thanks again, and have a great day.
Thanks, guys.